It is my sincere pleasure to introduce James Corbett, one of the best and most prolific documentary creators online today. If you haven't seen his two-part series, How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World, I highly recommend it. I've watched them at least 4 full times now. I'll put the links in the show notes. James, are the climes in Western Japan sunny today?
They are indeed. Yeah, sometimes I feel like it's a lie when it's raining outside and I have to say the sunny climes of Western Japan because that's my thing, but it is actually sunny today. So yes, it lives up to the hype.
Well, you've been doing the walks in the park and the car. There's a little bit of a variety change lately, all this COVID stuff.
Yeah, I like to throw in some outdoor stuff every now and then. In fact, as we record this, I'm about to post another outdoor video. So there you go. For anyone who wants to see me in the beautiful sunny sky climes of Western Japan, they will be able to do so very shortly.
Wonderful. All right, well, let's get right into it. In order to understand the future of money, it's helpful to understand the present and how it came to be that way. Let's take it back to 1910. What happened at Jekyll Island in 1910?
Well, the long story short that some people will not want to hear is a conspiracy happened, but this is literal conspiracy history, and we don't have to speculate about it. It is not a theory. It is actually admitted history, admitted by the participants in the conspiracy itself. Essentially, you had a number of some of the most important banking members of the banking establishment in the U.S. at that time, or their representatives, meeting at Jekyll Island. And specifically, the story is that on November 22nd of 1910, you had Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was not only the Senate Finance Committee chair at that time, but also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., so a pretty important person in the American banking establishment at that time, because of course the Rockefellers did go into banking, as evidenced by David Rockefeller, Chase, and all of that. But you had Senator Nelson Aldrich, you had Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of National City Bank, Henry P. Davison, who was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan. You had Benjamin Strong Jr., who was an associate of J.P. Morgan and president of Bankers Trust. You had Paul Warburg, the heir of the Warburg, the infamous Warburg banking family, who was the son-in-law of Solomon Loeb of Kuhn Loeb and Company. And you had A. Pyatt Andrew, who was the assistant treasury secretary, the assistant treasury secretary at the time. They all got together on a train that, who had actually ordered that train? I believe it was the private car of...
Yeah, it was Aldrich, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And they made their way to Jekyll Island in total secrecy. The press were thrown off the trail. The private car was it was parked at a separate station in Hoboken or something to get away from the press in New York, and everyone boarded secretly. They had special instructions to their staff to call them only by first name. Do not use any names during any of this trip. We don't want any word of this leaking out. And so they went down to Jekyll Island, and over the course of the next few days, they hammered out a plan for creating a central bank in the United States to be essentially a legalized oligopoly of the banking interests of the U.S., obviously represented by Morgan and the other big banking firms at that time. And they hammered out this plan. They got it made. They went, and it was presented to Congress and struck down. So there you go, conspiracy foiled, right? Well, no, not exactly. Then it was forwarded again in Congress in a slightly revised format. You see, everyone knew that this other idea was coming from Aldrich, which everyone knew. There was a big surge against the banking establishment because of the bank runs and the panics that had happened pretty regularly over the preceding decades, especially in 1907. There was a big banking panic that caused all sorts of distress in New York, which spread and rippled out throughout the whole of the country. People were saying, we must do something to chain down these bankers. Here comes Senator Nelson Aldrich proposing this plan to create this central bank that's going to give all this power to the banking. No. We want something else. So, of course, Stiegel of the Glass-Steagall Act Carter Glass ended up forwarding this revised legislation. No, we don't want the Aldrich plan. We want this plan, a plan for the Federal Reserve, which was basically the Aldrich plan in all but name. All of this key details of how the money interests were going to control the money supply of the United States were in there. And it got forwarded. And because it seemed to be going against the banking establishment, people were on board with it. And you had the Democrat, the President Woodrow Wilson, this progressive who got voted into office, and he's championing it, and it gets passed during highly suspicious circumstances during the quorum that was declared the Christmas break, essentially, right at the wire when most of the senators and congressmen had already gone home. This legislation gets passed and then signed into law immediately on, I believe it was December 23rd of 1913. So under highly suspicious circumstances, through an admitted conspiracy that Frank Vanderlip confessed to some decade plus later, in the pages of the Saturday Evening Post, of all places. You can go and read it online. I've linked it up in my documentary on the Federal Reserve at corbettreport.com/Federal Reserve. Yeah, it was an open, admitted conspiracy, obviously not open at that time, but now it is an admitted conspiracy that created what we now know of as the Federal Reserve, which was the third central bank of the United States and the one that has basically controlled the money supply of the United States for the past 107 years. For the interests of the banking establishment that admittedly owns the privately held reserve banks.
You and I know this, but we need to explain it. The Federal Reserve, is that federal like the federal government or Federal Bureau of Investigation, or is that more like Federal Express?
Yeah, exactly. That's the old tagline. It's not federal and it's not a reserve, which is true and not true. It depends on how you look at it, because of course this was given the imprimatur of Congress. It was passed in legislation that created the Federal Reserve with a 20-year mandate, and it was going to have to be renewed. But of course, during that course of that 20 years, that 20-year mandate was revised in the legislation, and now the Federal Reserve will never expire. It will continue going until an act of Congress demolishes it, or until it implodes, which actually I think is probably more likely in the not too distant future. But that was the original mandate. It was a 20-year mandate, and it was an act of Congress, and it set up this beast that is kind of a two-headed beast, so that they can always show you one of the heads and say, look, you see, this is a congressionally created beast that we have created, so we control it, and the president appoints the governor of the board, and we control it. This is a congressional thing. And so the board, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, this is a congressional body. But it also consists of this other head, which is the 12 regional banks. And the regional banks are especially, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is really the heart of the system. It is Wall Street. It is the heart of the monetary beast in the United States. It controls essentially the operations of the system generally, and the regional banks also get to appoint members to the board in Washington. But more importantly, the regional banks are admitted in court, which I have in my documentary. You can see the lawyers for the Federal Reserve regional banks admitting this in court. They are a privately owned entity. They are owned by the banks that are members of those regional banks. If you are a Federal Reserve Bank participant, like all of the major banks, the national banks that you can think of in the United States are essentially, then you are by virtue of that, you are a shareholder, a stakeholder in the Federal Reserve regional banks. You are part of the ownership of that. So it is a two-headed beast. There is a public component to it. There is a private component to it. The real question is who has power over this system.
Well, and who owns it, because it's in their charter that it pays 6% annual dividends, and that's on the entire monetary supply. People don't understand that our national debt is simply a tokenized representation of our future claims against our earnings. I mean, it's a self-referential system. Elegant. I got to give those guys props, and especially that it's lasted 107 years. But it wasn't just big banks that ended up owning this. You had a lot of individual families and people as owners. And then if you do the compounding on that over multiple generations, and then do the math, I mean, I laugh every time I hear that Bill Gates and Bezos are the richest guys on the planet, because there's multiple trillionaires. I mean, just even off of derivatives, gross notional is quadrillions, and who knows what
Right.
Deutsche Bank has on its real balance sheet, and Maiden Lane and all this stuff. So people talk about getting the money out of politics, but really, when politics is inherent in money, you have some sticky issues. And so one of the things that I wanted to get into, I mean, I think we'll have time, but let's make sure to cover it, since this is the future of money, is that there's a couple of different paths of where we're going. The CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies, represents one paradigm of what we could expect in our system of money that operates according to certain principles. And then things like Bitcoin offer the possibility of other types of ways of doing it, but they're facing a strong uphill battle against organized forces. Even Facebook wasn't strong enough to challenge the ECB with its Libra project. So I personally think there's going to be a new Bretton Woods, where it's not gold that people end up using as the backstop, but at least partially it should be based on Bitcoin, because nobody knows how much gold everybody has, but everybody knows how much Bitcoin everybody has, because it's a private or a public ledger that's completely transparent. So anyway, we'll get back to that. But what I wanted to ask you is, central banks all over the world have announced plans to unveil so-called central bank digital currencies. How are these different than an actual cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin?
So I think the important thing to understand about this is central bank obviously implies some sort of centralization, which I think people will understand, hopefully in your audience will understand, is exactly anathema to the idea of a decentralized distributed ledger. And so there are many different ways to implement a central bank digital currency. It could be done in different ways. And to be fair, the banksters themselves have talked about different ways that this could be done. So it isn't to say that there's one particular way this is going to be implemented, but there's still that underlying idea that somehow at base, this is about some sort of centralized control over some sort of digital currency. And if you want more details on that, I'm going to refer you to a couple of things. First of all, there was a report put out by the Bank for International Settlements, which is a bank that you should be familiar with. If they are not, please look into that. It is a very, in fact, I would say the most important banking institution in the world, at least overtly. And in 2017, they had a white paper that was published under their auspices in the BIS quarterly review called Central Bank Cryptocurrencies. And if you go and download that document, you will see they have created this taxonomy of money, as they call it, which is this like overlapping Venn diagram flower thing that actually makes things a lot more complicated than I think I have more questions after looking at this. But for example, they look at the different ways that you could implement some sort of digital currency, like a central bank issued one or a peer-to-peer one. Is it electronic? Is it universally accessible, etc.? And they look at the different ones and how they would be implemented. So you can start, I guess, getting a handle on it there. Another place I would recommend people to go is another part of the Bank for International Settlements website is a speech by Augustin Carstens, the general manager of the BIS, that was delivered in Dublin last year, called "The Future of Money and Payments." If people go to that, they'll see much more about this idea of central bank digital currency and what it is and what it isn't and how it can be implemented. For example, I mean, just as one idea here, are you going to have a token issued central bank digital currency, or is it going to be based on accounts? I.e., will you have an account with the Federal Reserve or whatever your local central bank is your national central bank is, in order to access those funds? Or will it be a token that can be distributed and traded freely? And what does that mean? And you can see that they break it down. For example, tokens have 24/7 availability built in. It's an existing feature. With accounts, that might be a feature. Tokens have 24/7 total anonymity if you want to implement that in the right ways, asterisk, etc. Yeah, exactly. Accounts, you cannot have that. So that's not a function. Is it interest bearing? Tokens can be interest bearing. Accounts can be interest bearing. So they break through all these different categories and look at the different ways this can be implemented. But again, at base, what they're talking about is creating some sort of digital currency that will be controlled and administered by the central bank in one way or another. It could be done more freely in terms of freely tradable tokens that they don't personally manage, that you could have. You could imagine that people could have their own wallets, that, you know, develop their own wallets for these tokens and whatever. I don't think that's the likely way this is going to go. I imagine most central banks are going to go the account route, where you have an account that is directly tied to the central bank, that they will be able to inject funds directly into your accounts, which may become important in the coming fourth industrial revolution automated economy, where we are automated out of the workforce and subsistent living off of the UBI payments coming from on high. Oh, hey, here's a brand new idea we just thought of. We'll issue these central bank digital currency into your central bank wallet. What an amazing idea that, oh, we've been talking about openly for years now. You can go back to Davos just, I believe this year actually, in Davos in January, they were talking about the idea of the Federal Reserve digital dollar. There was a digital dollar foundation that was created last year. That was, all of this was laid out. And what did they try to slip into the emergency stimulus money, the CARES Act, in the wake of this? They tried to insert that exact legislative proposal that had been on the books since at least last year for the digital dollar. This is not a new idea, but they're going to use the panic that's being generated right now in order to sell it to the public.
And so let's unpack the specific attributes of such a system. What about negative interest rates and bail-ins? Let's take it one piece at a time. There's a lot here. So negative interest rates and bail-ins.
All right, negative interest rates and bail-ins. Yeah. Yes, I mean, this is another aspect of things that doesn't get as much attention. People at least are familiar with the concept of negative interest rates right now because it has been implemented in Europe. And the problem with negative interest is obviously, well, if people are going to lose money on their holdings, then why are they going to, what's the incentive here? Why would people actually keep their money in a form that is going to be losing money, that they know guaranteed is going to be losing money when they could be earning interest somewhere else? Well, obviously people will not do that. So they will withdraw their holdings and keep it in cash so that it cannot lose its, at least, value in that sense. In the negative interest sense, they will keep the cash under their pillow if need be and actually make more money than if they were keeping it in the bank. Unless there was no cash. Sorry, you can't use cash anymore. No, with no holding anything physical.
They're telling me there's a coin shortage around here.
Exactly right. Yeah, now there's a coin shortage. Sorry, yeah. Oh, but don't worry. Electronic payments are getting easier and easier and easier, and you can just swipe your card or scan your phone or whatever it is, and you'll be on your merry way. So don't use cash anymore. And that is the very effective way of implementing negative interest rates in a way that you can't really escape, because then all of your holdings are just going to be in some digital wallet somewhere that you don't have control over the interest that is generated by that account or taken out of that account in case of a negative interest rate. And also bail-ins, again, as you say, I just did a questions for Corbett on this recently that people might want to check out. But essentially, there has been a regulatory framework that's been introduced over the last several years, rolled out most, I think, publicly and in your face with the Cyprus meltdown that happened. How many years ago was that? Probably 6 years ago or something like that. At this point.
6, 7 at this point.
Yeah. But people who don't remember, they went in and they were going to, I forget how it all took place, but they were going to take a certain percentage of any holdings, any account holdings that people have over a certain limit. They were going to take it out of people's account just automatically. There was some back and forth. People protested. And they made some concessions, but eventually they did take a certain percentage, I believe, over the 100,000 euro limit that is the safeguarded by the European Central Bank. Don't worry, if you have less than 100,000 euros in your account, you're fine. But if you have more, they will go in when they need to recapitalize the bank because there's been some sort of systemic meltdown or whatever. They will just take that money and say, boop, it's gone. Because here's the big secret that they don't want you to think too deeply about. When you put money in the bank, you are not putting money in some safe for safekeeping that is your money that you can take back later. You are literally lending that money to the bank. And if they lose that money, it's their play money once you give it to them. And if they lose that, then you're going to be on the hook to that to some extent. And so there's a whole capital infrastructure framework for how this is handled that was encoded in Basel III and implemented in various by central banks all around the world. There's a whole story behind that. But yes, that will be facilitated by central bank digital currencies because, again, people could at least theoretically hold some of their holdings outside of the bank system. If you're over that €100,000 limit or whatever it is in your locality, you might actually hold the excess in some format that you can take out of the bank, but not if it's all in the banking system because it's, again, all digital. So that's another aspect of this.
Well, and if you look at it that way, $13,000 Bitcoin doesn't seem so crazy anymore because people store wealth securely in gold, and that's 10 trillion. And you can do the same thing with Bitcoin for 300 billion. Sounds like a bargain, at least if you look at it that way. Now, what about outside of a strictly monetary sense? What about civil asset forfeiture in such a scenario?
Yes, again, this facilitates absolutely everything imaginable. Civil asset forfeiture, for people who don't know, is the government coming in and stealing your property because of anything, really. In fact, it has been and could be simply they pull you over because you got a busted taillight and they end up seizing your car. Those kinds of stories can happen, at least under the system as it exists in the United States specifically. And there are different, obviously it works differently in different locales. But the underlying idea is that, again, if you have a way of keeping your funds outside of the banking system and outside the purview of the state, then they can't seize what they can't see. But if they can see everything because you cannot keep it outside of the purview of the state, then they're going to seize it. And so that not only applies to civil asset forfeiture, but obviously taxation. And I think the prime example of that in recent years was what we saw with the demonetization in India, where they took some of the large out of circulation. They said, this is no longer legal tender. You have to turn in your old notes and we'll give you new ones. And that was deliberately part of a strategy to move people over towards electronic payment. That was also part of a deliberate strategy to bring in the black money, as they call it in India. They talk about black money, meaning literally money that the government doesn't know that people hold, so it's not taxable. But if you have to go in and physically turn in your old notes and get new ones or get digital dollars or whatever it is, they will know that you hold this money and they will be able to tax you on it. You will not be able to escape them. So now, and this is part of a whole infrastructure that India has been laying out with the Aadhaar system, the world's largest biometric database that assigns biometric ID based on fingerprints and iris scans for every single one of India's billion population. Are now enrolled in this program. Don't worry, we keep your data super safe. It'll never be stolen. Oh, wait, some of it just did leak. Oh, well, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. But now they're literally tying your biometric ID to your tax roll. So you will be scanned and put into their system. They will know all of your funds because it will all be processed electronically or held or in the purview of the state, and they will be able to automatically tax it from your account when and if they start the central bank digital currencies. So no escaping that in a cashless system that's under the purview of the central banks.
Well, I think everyone can agree that we need roads and schools. Whether we need to fund warfare and economic hitmen and stuff like that is another story. But let's just say, okay, roads and schools, common defense, all that good stuff. Taxation is the way to do it. People should pay their taxes. That's the end of it. But then you get into the messy realities of the world as it exists today, increasingly interconnected. There's a great book that you've probably read that I'll recommend here about the Panama Papers. Which was a leak from a firm that does offshore banking for a lot of the world's wealthiest people. And if you look at that, how complicated money flows really are, where you might have a Bermudan corporation that has a trust that holds intellectual property in Liechtenstein. Even Apple with its EU stuff in Ireland and these Dutch sandwiches. When the countries have their own digital currency and then interface that with another one, and they have different overlapping ideas of how things should be taxed, it could get really, really messy. And the numbers here are just astronomical. So there's obviously some risks there, but what about stuff like cancel culture and censorship on thought crimes? There's been a lot of people deplatformed, demonetized. If your money is censorable, then you are vulnerable, and ultimately you're a vassal. So this has important implications for that as well.
It certainly does. All right, a couple of things to note there. First of all, I know it was just a comment in passing, but you say people want roads, they want schools, they want these things, and you're right about that. But we also want food, we want clothes, but we don't expect that the government needs to tax us in order to create these goods. No, people want them, so other people will produce them. There will be a market for them. That's how this works. We do not need the government to point guns at people's heads and say, you must pay for this school. Oh, okay. I mean, that's not the ideal system, I think. So I can't let that go without commenting on it. The other aspect of, yeah, for example, yes, cancel culture or whatever that's evolving into at this point. You're exactly right. And people are finally starting to realize this, which I guess because I've been living so much of my life online in the last decade plus, I've seen this coming from a mile away. But now people are starting to feel it as they're getting deplatformed from all these social media and demonetization and AdSense and others taking people off their platform. And people are finding, oh, I might not be able to do business because I posted this thing on Facebook that the Facebook took down. So they took down my account. So now I can't open a Facebook account for my business. And all these kinds of things are starting to hit people in the pocketbook. How much worse will that be in a system of central bank digital currencies where all payment is through some sort of payment processor or payment provider like a PayPal or Libra or whatever system you come up with? There will be these central points of control that can literally remove people from their platforms so that they literally won't be able to buy or sell or transact. That's always been the quintessential nightmare scenario of basically being depersoned, which could never have really taken place. I mean, obviously people could be exiled in the past, in days of yore, exiled from a community or even a nation, but they would be able to go somewhere else and start a new life. But in completely central bank digital currency world, where once you get unpersoned, you will never be able to transact on this payment processor again, for example, because they decided they didn't like what you said over here or whatever the case may be. Yeah, that becomes a much more chilling reality where, again, if you didn't have decentralized, open, distributed ledger-based systems to get off of that, there would be very few ways to interact and transact with people otherwise. I should say, also, I want to interject this in the conversation. I certainly do think that cryptocurrencies absolutely provide a valuable part in all of this, but I think we shouldn't forget the old forms of being decentralized as well. We don't have to use fiat currency, but we can use community currencies, alternative currencies, precious metals, direct trade and barter. These things still exist, and I think will play different roles in different use cases. Different communities will have different uses for these types of transactions in this way or that way. But obviously, when we're talking about doing anything online, if it's not crypto, it's going to be controlled and censored at some point.
So that reminds me a little bit of the social credit score system in China, which not everybody might not be familiar with. I hear that if you criticize the government there, they can prevent you from riding the bus. What, if anything, would prevent that from happening here? Isn't the more generalized example of not being able to ride the bus that simply you have no money and therefore you can't do anything, and no other theoretical rights that you have are very useful in that scenario?
Yeah. This is where it gets difficult to really articulate this to someone who's never thought about it. I can't imagine there are many people who haven't thought about this at all by this point, but every part of this connects to every other part. As I say, government issued electronic ID, biometric databases, social credit scores, digital currencies, they all tie together in a framework of control, which, if you're an obedient, compliant citizen who dots all your I's and crosses all your T's and fills out your tax form correctly and never questions the government and never says anything wrong and never does anything that could ever possibly offend anyone else, then hopefully you'll be able to eke out a living as a neo-serf on the neo-plantation. But if you cross any of those lines, then all of those verities that people have always taken for granted because they couldn't be controlled centrally now are controlled centrally, and people can be subjected to all sorts of consequences as a result of their actions that would not have been imaginable. As you say, in China right now, there is the social credit system. They are actively denying people access to public transit or access to certain schools or whatever the case may be, based on their non-compliance, their non-obedience to central Chinese Communist Party diktats. And that obviously has been the Black Mirror sort of sci-fi scenario that's been in the public consciousness for years now. The idea that that is unthinkable in the free and liberal democracies of the West, or whatever you want to say, is ridiculous. I mean, I think only the most fairy tale dwelling normies who couldn't possibly imagine anything ever going wrong politically could even contemplate that this power will never be used for evil in our society. It will only be those evil Chi-Coms. No, of course, that is the system that is coming into place. And it doesn't always have to be so overtly boot in your face kind of tyrannical. It can be done in a lot of ways that just subtly coerce people into following this rule or following this, because everyone knows, oh, if you don't, you're going to be a Ross Ulbricht or whatever the case may be. They will throw the scapegoats in the prison forever to rot, to be the symbols of what will happen to people who disobey the diktats of the tyrants.
Speaking of evil, back to history for a moment. Wasn't part of the reason the Fed was created was to finance World War I?
Well, I guess that's a contentious statement. I think that is the case. And there is reason to believe that. For example, it was Norman Dodd working on the Reese Committee, which was looking into the tax-exempt foundations in the 1950s, who had a researcher who gained access to the archives of, I believe it was the Carnegie Endowment. I'd have to double check that reference, but people can check it. I've talked about it many times. Just type Dodd, D-O-D-D, into my search bar and you'll find this. I did an episode called History is Written by the Winners, or History by the Winners, which I played some excerpt of that interview where he talked about that. And the researcher who went to the archives and was reading the meeting minutes of the endowment, the Carnegie Endowment, from its inception, and noting exactly what was said and summarizing that in a dictaphone recording that was in the congressional record at some point. I'm assuming it still exists. I hope some researcher will dig it out at some point so we can actually listen to it. But she was literally talking and summarizing these meeting minutes as she was reading them, talking about how they were discussing throughout 1908, 1909, 1910, what is the best way to control society in the directions that we wish to push it. And they argued in a learned fashion for the course of the year in 1908 or whatever it was. And they came to the conclusion there is no better way to manipulate and control the direction of society than through war. So then the conversation turned to, how do we embroil the United States in warfare? And this, according to Dodd, this blew the researcher that he sent to look at these minutes. It blew her mind. It shattered her. She couldn't believe that this was the type of thing that they were discussing and trying to take. And then they talked about how they would take over the apparatus of the State Department and all of this, literally in the meeting minutes of this foundation, in order to steer the United States into warfare so they could better shape it. And there's all sorts of consequences that come from that. But clearly, I think there was an agenda on a number of different respects to steer the United States into war in that time frame, as well as other countries. And I talk about that in a documentary called The World War I Conspiracy that's up on my website, corbettreport.com/WWI. But long story short, yes, I think one of the reasons that, let's not even put it that way. It doesn't have to be causal in that sense, but one of the things that facilitated the US entry into war and made the war machine possible was the consolidation of control over the money supply that came with the creation of the Federal Reserve. So it doesn't even have to be that they were literally, there was a conspiracy to create the Federal Reserve in order to embroil the US in war, although all of that is true, but whatever. Let's just say it wasn't true. Still, that is the end result. World War I was financed with debt that was created through the monetary system that was established with the Federal Reserve Act. And even at that time, the Federal Reserve was just as the kernel of what it eventually became. And so there was a little hint of a seed of what was to come that really reached fruition throughout the 1930s into 1940s, and of course, World War II, which was absolutely, without the Federal Reserve financing that war through debt, it would not have been possible in the way that it was waged. So yes, central banks and the control over the money supply has always been an essential part of war making. And this goes back centuries and centuries. It goes back to Europe and the old world and all of that. But certainly you can see it with the Federal Reserve in World War I and World War II.
Now, what about the Exchange Stabilization Fund? Because when I do the math of compound interest since the citizens' gold was confiscated in Executive Order 6102 in 1933, that turns out to be a lot of money. And then, of course, you have Eric de Carbonell's work back in 2011, where he pulled some threads together. And then you've got John Perkins' Economic Hitman series. Another great book I'd recommend for people that are into this kind of stuff is one by Adam Labor called Tower of Basel, about the BIS. But maybe you can expound a little bit on how you see this all tying together as far as shadowy money and shadowy powerful organizations, some of which I've named and some of which I probably haven't.
Yes, you bring up some good references, although I must admit it's been nearly a decade since I looked at Carbonell, his work on ESF, and John Perkins I read again almost a decade ago. I have Adam Labor's up there on my bookshelf. So yeah, there's some great references in there. I hope people will check out some important stuff. I would have to research the details to refresh myself on all of those specific mentions, but I think the overall picture that this paints once people start delving into this is that power over the money supply really is power in shaping certainly foreign policy and domestic policy, shaping policies of governments generally. And I shy away, not just shy away, I eschew the spurious quotations that get thrown around too easily and misattributed, and who said that and when and what's the source on that? Who cares? It sounds about right. So I don't use those types of quotations. But here's the but.
Yeah.
It has been
good old Nathan
Rothschild, the founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, said that he who controls the money supply controls the nation. Or well, I can't remember the exact quote.
It was essentially, give me the power to coin a nation's money, and I care not which puppet sits on the throne. And the sun never sets on the British Empire. And I mean, I've seen a number of threads kind of branch off, and who knows what was said. But
yeah, exactly. I've never hammered down the source of that quotation. I don't know if it's true or spurious, but it is one of those quotes that it is true. Whether or not it was ever said by Mayer Amschel Rothschild, I don't know. But at any rate, the quote is true. Absolutely. Who controls the money supply gets to who writes the checks, makes the rules. It's that way in our personal lives. We all understand that in our households or with our family or friends or whatever. But it's also the same on the national level. And that's really when you start looking into the history of central banks and how they came about, back the Bank of England or the bank in Amsterdam, some of these central banks, some of the originals, you start to realize that this really was a group of interests that were taking over the kingdoms of that time and taking that power for themselves. And the king, once the king has to go cap in hand or crown in hand, I guess, to beg the bankers for some money so that he can wage war on France or whatever the case may be, like in the 1690s in England, by that point, who's in charge? Is it the king? Or is it the people who are lending him the money in order to do this? And of course, then it really feeds into the stories, for example, about the Rothschilds playing both sides in the Waterloo, and Nathan Rothschild's agents were able to get the news of Napoleon's defeat back to England before the official news came. So he was able to pretend to sell all his, oh no, we've lost, oh, I'm selling all my shares, but secretly buying everything up as everyone else floods into the market to sell their shares and buying everything up at pennies on the pound. Again, true story, fiction, what's the exact delineation there? The point is that he who controls information and who controls the money supply itself can thereby control a society. I don't think you have to be so far out there or so incredibly insightful in order to see this. This is basic, plain truth. It has always been thus. It is thus today. If anyone thinks otherwise at this point, I think there may be something wrong with them mentally that they should probably get checked. I mean, this is not a game. This is not a theoretical thing. This is truly the control at this point, as we're talking about this integrated global society with, transnational corporations and entities and NGOs and all these things that stand all around the world, we are talking about the control of the human species at this point, which also brings in all of the things about technology and genetic modification of humans and all of this crazy stuff that truly was out there, far out sci-fi type of stuff, even 20 years ago, is starting to come to fruition today, and it rests on the monetary base. This is why who controls the money, where it comes from, is the most important thing that we could possibly be talking about right now. And that's exactly why I think it has been denigrated as a joke. Where does money come from? It comes from trees. It grows on trees. Ah. And that's about the extent to which we teach our children about the root of the monetary problem that underlies all of the problems that we face as a society, even as a species.
Well, that's what we're going to try and do a better job of teaching people about. I mean, we're starting at kind of the extreme lunatic fringe of people who like to read these sorts of books and educate ourselves, but it's certainly not for everyone. And so I think education has a lot to do about making people aware what type of consequences there are for the rest of their lives based on the choices they make as far as the forms of money that they choose to use, because ultimately there's no such thing as intrinsic value when it comes to money, even gold, which I guess maybe could be jewelry, but you can't eat it. It's all value is subjective, and it's our belief that gives things value. And so the value of Bitcoin versus the dollar can be anything we want it to be based on the value that we get from it. Well, I know you have to go. This has been fascinating stuff, and I've learned so much from you over the years, and always appreciate what you have to say. Wanted to sincerely thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to make time for us here today. And where can people go to find out more about your work?
CorbettReport.com, that's CORBETT report.com. 13 years worth of archives there, now completely available for free. Download audio, video, textual material. If you're interested in Federal Reserve and history, just go to CorbettReport.com/Federal Reserve. I have a whole documentary up about it. If you're interested in big oil, as you said, CorbettReport.com/Big Oil. If you want to hear about those crazy World War I conspiracies I was ranting about, CorbettReport.com/WWI. Again, there's a lot of material up there. I just hope people will check into it. I never, ever, ever want people to take what I say at face value or on it without questioning. That's why I provide links to sources for everything that I'm talking about. And I go to the links. You know, if I mention Norman Dodd or whatever, go listen to what he actually said and come to your own conclusions. That's the kind of conversation I'm trying to open up on all the subjects that I explore.